We're going to continue looking at the after effects of the resurrection. That might be a good subtitle for this series, actually, the after effects of the resurrection. We've already looked at the stories that took place on the first day of the resurrection. We looked at doubting Thomas. We talked last week about the instructions Jesus gave the apostles on how to carry out the Great Commission and what that message should look like. Not all of those messages in this series are going to be stories of what happened after. Some of them are going to focus on what changed, what's significant for us now after the resurrection. That's one we're going to look at today in John chapter 10. If you want to go ahead and turn there, I'll read from that here in just a little bit. Today we're going to look at the concept of reliable leadership and the guidance that we have as we follow Jesus. Now, in the United States, we need a leader who can provide for us. In the United States, we need a leader who can help us understand what's going on and make the right decisions. Unfortunately, most of our leadership in the United States happens through our news media. The politicians use the news media to communicate what they're doing. When things change, the news media is supposed to report on that. In an era where we have so much social media and so little accountability for our news media, we have developed a new type of news that has been called fake news. You may have heard some of the stories that have come out that have turned out to be fake news. Did you hear about the living corpses in the Ukraine? Surely you've heard about this. The living corpses. There was this big battle in the Ukraine, a town called, I think it's pronounced Bakra, and there was this big battle, and there were a lot of bodies that were not collected. And when they finally took that territory back over and the Ukrainian army went through, they videoed the evidence, and they were driving through town, and there were these bodies on the side of the street, and as they drove by, in the video, you could see these bodies move. And the story began to circulate that the Ukrainians had figured out a way to animate corpses, and they were creating a zombie army. You guys don't look convinced. Some people actually believe this stuff. A little easier to believe is a gentleman they call the Ghost of Kiev. He was a fighter pilot. And apparently he led a charmed life. He couldn't be shot down. He took his older fighter and went against all these fifth-generation fighters from Russia and blew them all out of the air. You guys don't look convinced about that either. It's totally made up. Never happened. A little closer to home, some of you can remember a little incident that happened a few years ago called COVID-19. You remember how many cures there were for COVID-19? One of the most believed cures for COVID-19 turned out to be garlic. I don't know if they thought if you ate enough garlic, you wouldn't get close enough to anybody to catch COVID-19 or what it was, but these stories were circulated as if they were real. These are false news, and false news is any false information that is broadcast or published as if it is news. Now, if you're like me, when you first heard about fake news, at least I did this, I assumed that it was another word for propaganda. I grew up using the word propaganda and understood a little bit about what it was, but I did a little research and found out that fake news and propaganda are not exactly the same thing. Propaganda is something that has a little bit or a thread of truth in it. Usually it's a one side or the other that collects all the data that supports their argument and just totally ignores the other side. And they present it as if it is true and as if that's all the data. And over time, they convince the population that something is true. One of the greatest illustrations, if you don't mind my using it again, is evolution. If you take all the data from evolution, you can see that it's not true, but they only present the stuff that supports their side. Fake news is anything that's made up. It's a made-up story that never really happened, but it's intended to mislead, and it's presented as truth, with no kernel of truth in it at all. Now, you'll notice in that definition is the little phrase, intended to mislead. And we don't like to be misled, do we? In fact, when we realize that we have been misled, it starts a chain of events, a chain reaction. It's kind of predictable. It starts with surprise. Well, I believed that my whole life, and now it's not true? How can that be? And then it leaves us with confusion because we've got a gap in what we believe and we don't know what to put there. So, well, if that's not true, what am I supposed to believe? The next feeling is betrayal. All those times those people I trusted told me that was true and it never really was. Predictably, it leads to anger. How dare they? I will never believe them again. That's the loss of trust, where you don't know who to believe. And then you find yourself needing some kind of clarity. This fake news and the misleading nature that it has leaves us lost, without direction, and going the wrong way. To avoid being misled, we need to find a reliable guide, someone we can trust who has our best interests in mind. In the Bible, frequently that person is referred to as the shepherd. And Jesus in our passage today presents himself as a better shepherd, particularly over the Pharisees. I'll set the context for you here for just a moment. John chapter 10 follows. Probably you can predict this. John chapter 10 follows John chapter 9. In John chapter 9, we have the healing of the man born blind and the story of the investigation that the Pharisees have after that. It separates Jesus from the man he performed the miracle for just a little while. And at the end of John chapter 9, they get back together. And Jesus says, "Do you believe in me?" The man says, "Well, I don't know who he is. I couldn't see him. So who is it?" And Jesus says, "I am him." Jesus then says that he has come in order that those who are blind may see, and those who see will become blind. Well, the Pharisees, as being Pharisees, they've been eavesdropping. And they say, "What are you doing? You saying that we're blind?" Now, the concept of and the challenge for people who are blind is, who do you trust to guide you? You ever try to guide a blind person? Just a little tip for you. Don't ever reach out and grab them. You'll scare them to death. And they'll resist everything you ask them to do. But if you offer them your shoulder and let them hold onto your shoulder, and then you walk just a step or two in front of them, they're much more comfortable following that. The Pharisees are saying, "What, are we blind? We can't guide the people that we're supposed to guide?" And then Jesus goes into this longer sermon where he talks about himself as the shepherd, the best possible guide. And when we get to verse 11, we get to the part where he talks about himself as the good shepherd. Verse 11 says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep." Here Jesus is pointing out that he's the good shepherd because he's completely invested in the sheep. He will lay down his life, he says, for the sheep. And then to explain what that means, he contrasts himself with a hired hand, someone who is hired to watch the sheep, presumably at night, so that the shepherd can have one day a week off or something and go home and get some rest. And the hired hand out there by himself at night with the sheep sees the wolf coming. And when he sees the wolf coming, he says, "This isn't worth the pay." He jumps up and runs away and leaves the sheep to the wolf. He says, "I'm a good shepherd. I don't do that. When the danger comes, I put myself between my sheep and that danger, even if it's a wolf. And if I don't get the best of it, I'm willing to die to protect those that I lead." He goes on from there. Verse 14 says, "I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. so there will be one flock. Here we have Jesus saying that he's the good shepherd because he's completely connected. He starts out by saying, I know the sheep and the sheep know me. We know each other. It's just a description of the intimate relationship that only a shepherd can have with his sheep. They don't need to know what he's saying. They can recognize his voice, and they trust him to follow him. He talks about how it's just as close, I'm just as close to my sheep as I am to my Father. And my sheep are just as close to me as the Father is to me. But more than that, I'm not just connected to the sheep that you can see that are close by here. I'm connected to another flock. Most commentators will say that this is the Gentiles, that John has included this information Jesus communicated so that the Gentiles who will be reading his book, remember John wrote in about the year 90 or 95. It's after the Jews have been dispersed by the Romans and there is no more Jewish homeland. And he's saying the two flocks, the Gentiles and the Jews, will come together. And I already know that. And I'm already preparing for that. I'm even taking care of that eventuality years later. Jesus finishes here in verse 17 saying, for this reason the Father loves me. Why? Why does the Father love him? Because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Here's where he's talking about the resurrection. I know I'm going to have to lay down my life. I know I'm going to have to die. But it's not permanent. I'm going to reverse that. He talks more about that in verse 18. He says, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. He lays it down because he wants to. When I was growing up, I always pictured Jesus as coming to earth kind of reluctantly. I don't really want to do this. But since God the Father tells me I have to, and I have to be obedient, I'm going to have to do it. But here Jesus is saying, I don't do this because I have to. I do this because I want to. No one has forced me into doing that. He says, I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge, or this commission, I have from my Father. And here he's saying he's completely free. As the shepherd, he has no one else to be accountable to. He can do what is best for his flock because he has no third party with third-party wishes and desires and third-party agendas that he has to include somehow. He is, to use the old theological term, totally sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. What a tremendous guide and leader we have. Completely invested to our good and our safety. Completely connected to us and to his Father. And completely free to do what's best. Stop with me a minute now and just absorb what that means. Sometimes we get kind of quick going through these things. And let's just take a moment and absorb what that really means to us. Jesus is a better leader than those people that we have been looking to for leadership. He's going to give us better guidance than the people we've looked to for guidance. He's more reliable than those religious celebrities that we see on YouTube and we read about on Facebook and that we watch on TV. I've always kind of had an uncomfortable feeling with that guy who's on the video and he's wearing a suit that's more expensive than my annual salary. That wasn't a hint, by the way, Stan. Don't worry about it, okay? More expensive than my salary. He walks down through the audience as he leaves and he goes to the front door and he gets into a chauffeured limousine and he drives out through a parking lot full of Chevys and Fords. It makes me wonder if he's really got the flock's best interests in mind or if he's doing this for the money. Some of us can remember the televangelists who were caught doing that and paid the price back in the 70s and 80s. Jesus is more reliable than those religious celebrities. He's also more reliable than political leaders. We're in a political cycle now. We've got the presidential election coming up, but don't forget that there's also going to be an election of representatives for the House of Representatives and senators. And politicians are one of those groups of people we like to make jokes about. My favorite joke about a politician is, how can you tell when they lie? You can see their lips move, right? And now, I don't think that's necessarily fair to the politicians. They are in a career where in order to do anything good at all, they first got to get elected. And in order to get elected, they have to tell you what you want to hear so that you will vote for them. Now, the best illustration I can think of that, and I think it will hit home here in Enid, this is not true, okay? This is an illustration. It's just something I came up with out of my imagination. I'm not spreading fake news, okay? But just imagine that you live in a town that is very dependent on an Air Force base. Some of us can imagine that. And that Air Force base, there's talk about closing that Air Force base. And during the election, some politicians come to town and they campaign to get your votes. What do you think they're going to say? Are they going to say, yes, I think it's the best thing we do is to close that Air Force base? Or are they going to look at you and say, doesn't matter what happens, I'm going to make sure that Air Force base stays open? What do you know about that guy? He'll lie about other things too. Because if he's running for the House of Representatives, he is going to end up being one vote out of 435. He's only got one vote. If he's a senator, he's got one vote out of 100, whether that Air Force base closes. He's just misled you by saying he has the power to make sure that doesn't happen. And politicians, by the nature of their job, do that all the time. We need to be careful if we're looking to politicians as good leaders for our lives. They may not have our best interests in mind. Even worse, these health gurus. I spend a lot of time on YouTube, and if I see one more ad that says if I just eat this brown rice, I'm going to lose 35 pounds overnight, I'm going to scream. You know what I think of when I think of a health guru? I grew up with my mom. Every morning at 10 o'clock, she'd sit down her coffee on the table next to her chair, and she'd turn on the TV and watch Jack LaLanne. Anybody here remember Jack LaLanne? It always started with him doing all those jumping jacks, okay? And then he'd do push-ups or sit-ups or squats or whatever else he was doing for 30 minutes. And I always wondered what the big deal was about him. So when I got old enough, I got the chance to read some literature. Basically, I got an encyclopedia. For those of you who don't know, an encyclopedia is the internet before the internet, okay? I looked up Jack LaLanne on the internet, and he was the guy who for his whole life did these tremendous feats of strength. And I saw a picture of him in a bay with a rope around his shoulders, towing a battleship. So if you want to get stronger, this is probably a guy who can tell you how to do that, right? And they were, down through the years, they've gotten more bold in their claims. And, you know, if you eat brown rice, you're going to lose 35 pounds overnight, and you're going to live longer, and you're going to look better, and people are going to love you more, and life will be wonderful forever and ever. Amen. You know what I know about Jack LaLanne? He's dead now. And all of these gurus are eventually going to die. And they can promise you pie in the sky by and by, and if you buy their product and you take their pill, you're going to be healthy and happy forever and ever. But it's a lie. They don't really have your best interest in mind. They have your pocketbook in mind. Now compare those to Jesus. Before the crucifixion, Jesus said he would rise, and everybody laughed at him. Before the crucifixion, he said he would reign. They started to hate him. Right before the crucifixion, he said he was God, and they crucified him for it. But since the resurrection, look at what's happened. He's alive. 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3, gives the story of how he stood before the women on the mount where he was buried. He stood before the ladies. He met with the apostles that evening. Sometime later, he met with 500 disciples all at one time. There goes the mass delusion argument. That never happens. Says that he met with Peter. Says that even later on, he met with Paul. He showed them that he was alive. And down through the centuries, millions of Christians have been thoroughly convinced that Jesus really is alive today. Since the resurrection, he's been reigning. If you look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, it says that he has dominion. Dominion specifically over the church. The church is the forerunner of the kingdom, the preparer of the people to receive the kingdom when Jesus returns. And Jesus has dominion over the church. In Ephesians, it says he has dominion over principalities and powers, over angels and demons. And eventually he will return and have dominion over every square foot of this planet. Since the resurrection, Jesus has been sitting with God. Read Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, where it says he is seated at the right hand of God. That is the position of power. We would call that the heir apparent, or the number 2 man in God's kingdom, God's eternal kingdom. Jesus has made good on all of his promises. Jesus has made good on everything that he said he would do. Now that brings me to the point where I have to ask a question. Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? Why do people still resist the leadership of Jesus Christ? Why do people still say, no, I don't want any of that in my life? Isn't that enough? Why wouldn't we see that and say, that's the source that I need? You know, John chapter 3, verse 36 has John the Baptist speaking. Makes it about as plain as you can get. John the Baptist says, anyone who believes in the Son has life. But anyone who does not obey the Son, anyone who does not trust him enough to do what he says to do, that's what that word obey means. It's the only, I think it only appears 2 other times in the whole Bible where it's being convinced to the point where it changes your behavior. Anyone who doesn't obey the Son will never see life. But the wrath of God remains on him. Now, anybody who's heard that, anybody who saw it on the video, anybody who ever read that passage is now without an excuse. You know that God has so orchestrated the world that you only have 2 choices. You can continue to be your own boss and continue to mess things up. You can continue to follow other people's advice and end up with broken relationships and messed up bodies and depression and anxiety. Or you can receive the gift that Jesus is offering, the leadership that will guide you to something better, will lead you to eternal life. Now that's the time when all of the stuff that's messed up on this earth no longer has any input in your life. That's the day that, for most of us, when we will die and walk directly into Jesus' presence. For some of us, we may actually survive until he returns and see him set up his kingdom here on this earth and help him to run that kingdom. But I know enough about the young folks, especially those that are on the internet, because they make comments. Yeah, there you go again, promising pie in the sky by and by. Make it a little more practical, okay? Jesus called it abundant life. The passage we're looking at, I started at verse 11. Go back 1 verse. Verse 10 says, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. What does that abundant life look like? Well, there's lots of places in the Bible that talks about it. Probably the best known is Galatians 5, 22 and 23. Abundant life is filled with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Anybody who says they don't want those things in their life will lie to you about other things. They may be a politician. Man, I said that on video, didn't I? Other destinations Jesus will lead you to, reconciled relationships. Jesus says a lot about reconciled relationships. Matthew chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 18 are primarily about relationships. How the goal in all relationships, if we make the goal in all of our relationships the glory of God, then relationships are easier to maintain. When there is a disruption in those relationships, we have to remember to get the log out of our own eye first, okay? Jesus said, how can you talk to the other guy about a speck in his eye when you got this telephone pole sticking out of your eye? Confess our own contributions to the disruption in relationship, and we'll be able to reconcile it a lot easier. Matthew 18, he talks about going and gently confronting those people who have offended you. And then throughout Galatians and other places, it talks about how we can move forward, rebuilding the trust, and rebuilding the relationship that we had in the beginning before it was damaged. Jesus will lead us to being humble instead of arrogant. Again, helping in all kinds of ways, but primarily in relationship. About being submissive instead of rebellious, so that our relationships with people that God has put above us is smoother, like our employers and government officials. If you've ever had a run-in with the law, you know how badly that goes and how submission makes it easier. Ultimately, he'll lead us to holiness. Holiness is basically, I could talk about sanctification and all kinds of fancy words, but holiness is basically being like Jesus. The longer we follow him, the more we become like him. That's a pretty significant promise. That's a pretty important destination to reach. And that promise is given to us by the one who kept the promise to rise from the dead. And that's why we have the ability to trust him. And if we'll follow him like that, if we follow Jesus as our leader, we'll never be lost. We won't lack direction. And we'll never find ourselves going the wrong way. Please bow with me. We'll pray. Father, many times in our lives we've found ourselves rebelling against the direction that you've given us. It's embarrassing to consider the times that I've known what I should have done and failed to do it. It hurts to remember the times that I've acted without consulting you first and regretted it. I thank you for your grace and your forgiveness that allows us to start over, and promise that you'll never leave us or forsake us, no matter how challenging our life and our decisions are. Father, I thank you for the promise that Jesus is our good shepherd and will do whatever is best for us and lead us to whatever position we need to be so that you can get the glory and you can do in our lives the best good. Please continue to lead us. Help us to follow you wholeheartedly. In Jesus' name, amen.